The massive multi-million-dollar corporate coffee factory aggressively dumped 40 tons of highly acidic, toxic waste at the poor 15-year-old black boy's wooden fence every single month. They thought they were ruthlessly crushing him and getting away with an illegal disposal scheme. 15 years later, when exactly 20 heavy commercial trucks unexpectedly arrived at that exact same fence line, the arrogant factory manager discovered the absolute terrifying truth. He hadn't destroyed the boy. He had accidentally handed him the exact blueprint to build an unstoppable, highly profitable agricultural empire. But first, let me take you back 15 years. Back to 1998. The Callaway farm wasn't a multi-million-dollar empire back then. It was 42 acres of dead dirt, a broken tractor, and a massive pile of past-due bank notices. Marcus was just 15 years old. His father, Thomas Callaway, had passed away unexpectedly that winter, leaving him and his mother, Darlene, with nothing but a mountain of suffocating debt. Thomas was a stubborn, fiercely proud man. He loved that piece of land more than anything in the world. But his intense financial struggles began long before the bank notices arrived. Years earlier, the massive Northgate coffee processing factory was built just 5 miles down the rural county road. Thomas had fiercely opposed it at the local town hall meetings, aggressively warning everyone about the devastating industrial pollution. The corporation coldly dismissed him as just another uneducated, complaining farmer. They built the massive concrete plant anyway, and their heavy commercial trucks completely destroyed the quiet rural roads. Thomas fought desperately to keep his small organic farm alive, while the factory's massive toxic shadow loomed over the entire county. He lost that brutal fight. Darlene tried desperately to hide the impending financial ruin. She kept the bright red past-due bank notices tucked carefully under the pepper shaker on the worn kitchen table. But Marcus saw them. He watched his grieving mother nervously count loose change late at night, hiding her blistered, calloused fingers under the wooden table. The brutal Ontario winter was coming incredibly fast. The wind already carried that bitter, bone-chilling cold. They desperately needed cash. If they didn't pay the bank by November, they'd lose the family farm before the first heavy snow even hit the frozen ground. That's exactly when the Northgate factory made a highly calculated offer. The massive factory had a sudden logistical problem. They needed a cheap place to dump their heavy industrial waste, specifically thousands of pounds of rotting, highly acidic coffee grounds. The logistics manager back then didn't want to pay the expensive commercial tipping fees at the county dump. He knew the Callaways were desperate and grieving. So he drove his expensive car to their muddy driveway and offered Darlene $50 a week to use a corner of her wooden fence line as an industrial dumping ground. He didn't offer a formal long-term contract with basic environmental protections. He handed her a single piece of paper with highly predatory terms, locking her into an indefinite, inescapable agreement. It was a brutal, disgusting display of corporate leverage. $50. It was barely enough to buy cheap groceries for a single week, but for Darlene it was pure survival. With trembling hands, she signed the predatory paper. The beautiful garden, the exact piece of land Marcus's father had spent his entire life working, was about to become a toxic landfill for the very corporate giant he had fought against. $50 a week could barely keep the lights on. But what Marcus didn't know was that it would cost them their peace. 2 days later, the first heavy truck arrived. It was a massive yellow Ford dump truck. Its heavy air brakes hissed sharply as it backed aggressively up to the weathered wooden fence. The heavy metal bed tilted up with a loud, violent metallic grind. Thousands of pounds of wet, steaming coffee sludge poured onto the ground like a dark, unstoppable avalanche. The smell hit them immediately. And I need you to completely understand, this wasn't the warm, comforting scent of your morning coffee. It was the sharp, violently sour stench of actively fermenting acid. It burned the back of your throat and made your eyes instantly water. The smell drifted right across the property line. Old man Whitfield, their wealthy neighbor, leaned casually against his fence and tapped his pipe. He didn't offer to help the grieving family. He just laughed loudly. "Looks like you're the garbage boy now, Marcus," he sneered. Marcus didn't say a single word. He completely ignored the old man. He walked silently into the wooden shed, picked up a heavy, splintered wooden shovel, and walked right up to the steaming, toxic pile. If he didn't contain the wet sludge, it would spill out onto the county road and cause a massive legal issue. He dug aggressively into the black, wet mess. The acidic mud stuck tightly to the wood, making every single scoop weigh 20 pounds. He gritted his teeth and kept shoveling for hours until his shoulders burned like fire. His only good pair of jeans was completely ruined. The sour stench seeped deep into his skin. It was a smell so strong, so permanent, that kids at his high school would soon start walking the other way when they saw him in the hallway. Whitfield watched the teenager struggling in the toxic mud, a highly satisfied grin plastered on his face. He thought he was watching a poor kid drowning in corporate garbage. He was completely, entirely wrong. The acid from the coffee waste didn't just smell incredibly bad. It was violently toxic to the agricultural soil. Marcus had planted a small, hopeful row of potatoes near the fence just a month earlier, hoping to harvest something before the deep frost. But the acid seeped through the ground like a dark poison. When he went to eagerly check on his crop 3 weeks later, the leaves weren't green. They were yellow, curled, and completely brittle. He dropped heavily to his knees in the wet dirt. He grabbed the thickest stem of a dead potato plant and pulled hard. The roots didn't snap. They just mushed. They were completely black, melted like soft wax from the incredibly high acidity of the waste. It was completely dead dirt. Absolutely nothing could survive here. Marcus dropped his head in total defeat. The wet black soil crumbled slowly in his calloused hands. He was physically exhausted. He was 15, grieving his father, and completely covered in someone else's industrial trash. He was fully ready to quit. Then he heard soft footsteps on the gravel. Darlene walked slowly out into the ruined garden. She saw his ruined clothes. She saw the dead, melted plants. She didn't yell at him. She didn't complain about the overwhelming smell. She just knelt down quietly in the toxic mud beside him. The silence of the dead garden felt incredibly heavy. Then Darlene looked right into her son's eyes. "They can dump their waste on our land, Marcus," she said softly but with absolute conviction. "But they don't decide what we grow from it." She reached over her blistered hands, diving fearlessly into the toxic mud, and helped him pull up the dead roots. That single sentence didn't just briefly comfort him. It completely changed the entire trajectory of his life. Marcus didn't just shovel the toxic sludge on weekends. He did it every single morning before school. He would wake up at 4:30 a.m. in the freezing pitch-black dark pull on his stiff mud-stained jeans and shovel the heavy wet coffee waste so the toxic runoff wouldn't ruin the county road. By the time he walked into his first period math class, his muscles were already screaming in absolute pain. But the intense physical exhaustion wasn't the worst part. It was the smell. You can wash your hands a dozen times with cheap abrasive bar soap. You can scrub aggressively until your skin is raw and bleeding. But the acidic stench of rotting coffee beans doesn't just wash off. It seeps permanently into the deep pores of your skin. It clings aggressively to your hair. When Marcus sat down at his desk, the girl next to him pinched her nose, packed up her books, and slid her chair 2 feet away in complete disgust. The boys in the back row started making loud, obnoxious gagging noises. They didn't know his father had just died. They didn't know his mother was crying over past due bank notices every single night. They just knew him as the pathetic kid who smelled like an industrial garbage dump. One afternoon, a group of upperclassmen cornered him roughly by the metal lockers. One of them held a half-empty cup of cold, sticky coffee. He tilted it aggressively, dumping the brown liquid right into Marcus's open backpack, completely ruining his math textbook. "Just giving you some extra inventory, garbage boy," the senior laughed loudly. Marcus's fists clenched immediately. His knuckles turned bone white. He was big enough to fight back. He wanted to swing hard. But then he remembered the $50. He remembered his mother's blistered, exhausted hands. If he got violently expelled, he couldn't help her save the farm. So he didn't throw a single punch. He just picked up his ruined, coffee-soaked notebook, locked his jaw tight, and walked away in dead silence. He swallowed his pride because family survival was infinitely more important than high school revenge. But on a pouring, rainy Tuesday evening, something entirely unexpected changed. Marcus was out by the wooden fence in the driving rain, aggressively digging a deep trench to keep the acidic runoff away from the rest of the property. He drove his heavy wooden shovel deeply into the very bottom edge of the oldest coffee pile and flipped the heavy dirt over. He froze completely. He dropped the shovel directly into the mud. The dirt at the absolute bottom of the pile didn't look normal. It wasn't the dead yellow, highly acidic clay that had violently killed his potato plants. It was incredibly dark. It was profoundly rich. And it was moving. Marcus dropped heavily to his knees in the wet dirt. He shoved his bare hands directly into the freezing soil. Right there, thriving aggressively in the highly acidic coffee grounds that were supposed to violently kill everything, was a massive, writhing colony of red wiggler worms. There were thousands of them twisting wildly in the dark mud. They were aggressively eating the rotting coffee waste and leaving behind pure, dark, incredibly nutrient-dense worm castings. He pulled a massive handful up to his face. The deep smell at the bottom of the pile wasn't sour anymore. It didn't burn his throat. It smelled exactly like a fresh, vibrant forest after a massive rainstorm. The worms were doing the absolutely impossible. They were actively neutralizing the toxic acid. They were aggressively transforming corporate waste into the richest, most valuable organic fertilizer on the planet. Marcus just stared blankly at his hands. For the very first time since his father's sudden death, he didn't see a massive pile of garbage. He saw a massive opportunity. But he had a huge, highly technical problem. He had absolutely no idea how it scientifically worked. Marcus didn't own a computer. The Callaway farm certainly didn't have an internet connection. So the very next day after school, he didn't go straight home to shovel toxic garbage. He walked 3 miles in the freezing, pouring rain directly to the county public library. He bypassed the fiction section entirely and pulled out massive, dusty university textbooks on soil microbiology, organic chemistry, and commercial vermicomposting. For 6 long weeks, Marcus practically lived in that quiet library. He sat in the dark back corner, completely surrounded by massive stacks of books, furiously taking highly detailed notes in a cheap spiral notebook. He learned that the specific red worms, Eisenia fetida, could aggressively consume half their total body weight in organic matter every single day. But his first attempt to harness them was an absolute disaster. He eagerly scooped a bucket of the worms and dumped them directly into a fresh pile of coffee waste, expecting them to instantly multiply. Instead, within 48 hours, every single worm was dead. The fresh acid had completely burned them alive. It was a devastating, heartbreaking failure. He ran frantically back to the library. He combed through the thick chemistry textbooks until his eyes burned. That's when he finally discovered exactly why the rest of the garbage pile was still incredibly toxic and why his worms had died. It was entirely about the C/N ratio, carbon to nitrogen. Coffee grounds are incredibly violently high in raw nitrogen. If you just leave a massive pile of pure nitrogen sitting in the hot sun, it forcefully ferments. It turns violently sour, highly acidic, and it literally burns delicate plant roots alive. That was exactly why his potato patch had died. To successfully neutralize the harsh acid and create the absolutely perfect, a stable environment for the worms to aggressively multiply, he needed carbon. A massive, unbelievable amount of it. And it absolutely had to be exactly 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Marcus stared intensely at the thick chemistry textbook. He ran his hands through his hair in deep frustration. Where on earth was a broke 15-year-old kid going to find thousands of pounds of free carbon? He spent the next 3 weeks aggressively scavenging the entire town. He rode his beat-up bicycle behind local grocery stores, desperately dumpster diving for massive discarded cardboard boxes. He ripped them into tiny pieces by hand until his fingers bled, mixing them aggressively into the wet coffee sludge. It worked, but it was incredibly slow. He needed a much bigger, faster source of raw carbon. The next morning, Marcus was walking quietly past the massive county public works building. He heard the incredibly loud, violent roar of a massive machine. He peeked carefully through the chain-link fence. The city landscaping crew was aggressively feeding massive dead oak tree branches into a massive industrial wood chipper. Out the other side blasted a massive, endless mountain of dry brown sawdust. Pure, unadulterated carbon. And the city was paying massive amounts of money just to haul it away to the dump. Marcus gripped the chain-link fence tightly. A slow, highly calculated smile finally spread across his face. He didn't just have a theory anymore. He had an exact scientific formula. And he was about to put it to the ultimate test. The very next morning, Marcus skipped the yellow school bus entirely. He walked 4 miles straight to the city's massive public works depot. The sprawling yard was heavily filled with towering mountains of sawdust and shredded wood chips. The city had a major logistical problem with this massive yard waste. They had to pay premium tipping fees just to dispose of it at the commercial dump. Marcus found the burly yard foreman sitting aggressively on the heavy steel tailgate of a municipal truck, drinking black coffee from a cheap styrofoam cup. The 15-year-old kid didn't timidly walk up and ask for a charity favor. He offered a highly lucrative, mathematically sound solution. "You're paying the county by the heavy ton to take your wood chips," Marcus said, his voice completely steady. "Dump them at my farm instead. I won't charge you a single dime, and it'll save your department thousands of dollars a month." The burly foreman looked down at the skinny teenager in the mud-stained jeans. He let out a deep, rumbling laugh. But he didn't say no. Free disposal was absolutely free disposal. In tight municipal budgets, that was a golden ticket. The very next day, a massive city dump truck arrived at the quiet Callaway farm. The heavy hydraulic lift whined loudly as it aggressively unloaded 3 tons of dry, carbon-rich sawdust right next to the rotting, highly acidic coffee waste. Old man Whitfield watched closely from his front porch, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. First, the kid hoarded highly acidic coffee garbage. Now he was hoarding dead wood. Whitfield muttered under his breath, completely convinced that Marcus had finally lost his mind under the extreme pressure of the bank debts. But Marcus was strictly following the hard science. He grabbed his heavy wooden shovel and started the incredibly grueling process of hand mixing. 30 heavy shovels of dry sawdust for every 1 shovel of wet coffee waste. His arms ached, his back throbbed violently, but he didn't stop. The dry carbon of the sawdust immediately absorbed the excess moisture. It locked in the highly volatile nitrogen. Within 48 hours, the violent acidic fermentation stopped entirely. The incredibly sour burning stench that had haunted Marcus for months simply vanished into thin air. The red wiggler worms exploded massively in population. They aggressively devoured the perfectly balanced organic matter, rapidly breaking it down. They were actively turning thousands of pounds of toxic corporate waste into pure black gold premium, highly nutrient-dense worm castings. But soon, Marcus ran into a massive logistical bottleneck. How do you physically separate hundreds of thousands of tiny red worms from massive tons of finished heavy compost? Doing it entirely by hand with a simple screen would literally take lifetimes. Marcus didn't have thousands of dollars for heavy commercial farming equipment, so he built his own from absolute scratch. He heavily scavenged a local auto scrapyard. He violently pulled a discarded electric motor from a broken washing machine, salvaged an old rusted bicycle chain, and bought a massive cylindrical drum of 1/4-inch hardware wire mesh. He bolted the heavy wire cylinder to a sturdy wooden frame he built from heavy scrap lumber. He attached the old washing machine motor to the spinning axis using the heavy bicycle chain. It was a homemade trommel screen, but building it wasn't a magical, seamless montage. It was an incredibly brutal, deeply frustrating process. His very first attempt was an absolute disaster. He wired the old washing machine motor completely incorrectly, and the very moment he excitedly plugged it in, it violently short-circuited. It blew the main electrical fuses in the entire house, heavily sparking and nearly burning the dry wooden shed completely to the ground. He spent 3 grueling nights, aggressively filing down the rusty metal gears, entirely by hand, perfectly aligning the bicycle chain so it wouldn't violently snap under the extreme weight of the wet dirt. When he finally flipped the heavy switch again, the massive metal cylinder roared loudly to life. The heavy bicycle chain rattled violently and the wire drum began to spin in a perfect continuous circle. Marcus rapidly shoveled the raw, heavy compost into the elevated end of the spinning drum. It was absolutely mesmerizing to watch. The fine finished dirt fell perfectly through the 1/4-inch holes, landing firmly in a dark, incredibly rich pile below. The worms and the larger uncomposted wood chunks simply tumbled out the other end, completely unharmed, ready to be aggressively tossed right back into a brand new pile of coffee waste. It was completely brilliant. It was brutally efficient, and it was about to become highly profitable. By his senior year of high school, Marcus wasn't the pathetic garbage boy anymore. He was aggressively bagging his premium worm castings and confidently selling them directly to local nurseries and organic farmers for $20 a bag. The soil was so incredibly rich in beneficial microbes and vital agricultural nutrients that the commercial farmers simply couldn't get enough of it. The $50 a week from the massive Northgate factory was now just a tiny fraction of his overall income. He proudly took a massive stack of $100 bills, walked straight into the local bank, and paid off his mother's past due notices completely in full. The Callaway farm was permanently saved. The crushing weight of debt was finally gone, but Marcus didn't stop there. Let's skip forward exactly 15 years. Marcus is now a highly successful 30-year-old man. The small, muddy corner of the fence line has completely transformed into a massive, highly efficient agricultural operation. He didn't just have compost piles sitting outside anymore. He had heavily constructed 3 massive, climate-controlled commercial greenhouses right on the exact same spot where his father's struggling garden used to be. Over the years, through intense, relentless scientific studying, he had discovered something else absolutely incredible about coffee waste. When it is properly pasteurized at extremely high temperatures to kill off competing bacteria and mixed heavily with a very specific ratio of hardwood sawdust, it creates the absolute perfect substrate for rapidly cultivating premium, highly expensive gourmet mushrooms. Inside the intensely humid greenhouses, the air smelled deeply earthy and incredibly clean. Thousands of white mushroom fruiting blocks perfectly lined the towering metal shelves. Marcus was successfully harvesting hundreds of pounds of organic shiitake and massive oyster mushrooms every single week. He started incredibly small, confidently pitching his very first harvest of massive shiitake mushrooms to a highly arrogant head chef at an incredibly expensive downtown restaurant. The chef took one look at Marcus's muddy boots and laughed right in his face, completely refusing to buy premium ingredients from a muddy local farmer. But Marcus didn't aggressively argue. He just quietly left a single, massive, absolutely perfect shiitake mushroom on the stainless steel counter and confidently walked out. The very next morning, the desperate chef frantically called Marcus, begging to heavily buy his entire agricultural inventory. The intense quality was absolutely unmatched. He wasn't just selling to local farmers anymore. He was heavily supplying the biggest high-end restaurants and organic supermarkets in the entire state of Ontario. And here is the most heavily ironic part of this entire incredible story. The massive Northgate factory was still aggressively dumping their coffee waste right at his farm, and they were still arrogantly paying the exact same $50 a week as per the original highly predatory contract Darlene had desperately signed 15 years ago to the massive corporate giant. Marcus was still just a cheap, reliable garbage disposal service. They had absolutely no idea what was actively happening behind those heavy greenhouse doors. But massive corporate greed always aggressively catches up. A completely new management team heavily took over at the massive Northgate factory. The new head of logistics was a man named Brent Gallagher, a 34-year-old highly arrogant MBA graduate who confidently wore tailored suits to a dirty factory floor and cared only about 2 major things: aggressively cutting operational costs and massively maximizing his own quarterly corporate bonuses. During his very first week, Gallagher decided to aggressively audit the company's historical waste disposal contracts. He dug deeply into the corporate archives and found the 15-year-old handwritten agreement with the tiny Callaway farm. He saw that Northgate was still aggressively producing 40 tons of coffee waste every single month, and the Callaways were quietly taking it all. When Gallagher quickly ran the exact numbers on his expensive calculator, his eyes lit up brightly. He saw a massive, highly exploitable corporate vulnerability. He saw an incredibly easy way to aggressively squeeze the poor farmers and heavily line his own corporate pockets. And he was about to actively make the absolute biggest, most devastating mistake of his entire corporate career. Before Gallagher even drove out to the farm, he was sitting in his air-conditioned, glass-walled office at corporate headquarters. He had the massive Northgate balance sheet spread out perfectly across his expensive mahogany desk. He had spent the entire morning loudly bragging to his senior corporate directors about how he was going to aggressively trim the fat and completely modernize their logistics network. He specifically targeted the Callaway farm. He saw an uneducated, vulnerable farmer, and he saw an incredibly easy target to heavily boost his own quarterly metrics. Gallagher didn't just want to cancel the contract. He wanted to completely erase the $50 a week historical expense from his corporate ledgers. More importantly, he wanted to heavily penalize the poor farmers for technically accepting toxic industrial waste without a formal commercial dumping license. It was a brutal, incredibly predatory legal loophole. He knew the Callaways were just local working-class farmers. They absolutely couldn't afford expensive corporate lawyers to fight a massive billion-dollar corporation in a drawn-out legal battle. He confidently drove his brand-new silver BMW out to the Callaway farm on a crisp, completely clear Tuesday morning. He parked right next to the muddy gravel driveway, stepping out incredibly carefully to avoid ruining his incredibly expensive Italian leather shoes in the rural dirt. Under his arm, he tightly carried a massive, thick legal envelope. Inside was a devastating, completely fabricated lawsuit for $80,000 in retroactive commercial disposal fees, massive environmental fines, and brutal breach of contract penalties. He fully aggressively planned to bankrupt the poor farmers and legally seize their land just to cover the entirely fabricated corporate debt. Gallagher confidently walked up to the old, weathered wooden fence line, fully expecting to see a devastated, completely toxic 15-year-old mountain of rotting acidic garbage. He braced himself, expecting to smell that deeply familiar, sickeningly sour stench of industrial decay. Instead, he saw Marcus. Marcus was wearing heavy rubber agricultural boots and a thick canvas apron, heavily stained with dark, rich dirt. He was effortlessly carrying a massive plastic crate, filled perfectly to the brim with hundreds of absolutely flawless, enormous shiitake mushrooms. "Are you Marcus Callaway?" Gallagher asked sharply, his tone absolutely dripping with intense corporate arrogance. Marcus stopped immediately. He set the heavy crate down gently on a wooden pallet. "I am." Gallagher tapped the heavy legal envelope aggressively against the wooden fence. "I'm Brent Gallagher, the new head logistics manager at Northgate. I'm here to officially terminate our waste disposal agreement, and I'm serving you with this." He shoved the thick envelope right into Marcus's chest. $80,000. "Try paying that with dirt, farmer." Gallagher let out a sharp, deeply mocking laugh. He fully expected the young farmer to completely panic. He expected him to instantly drop to his knees in the mud, tear open the envelope frantically, and desperately beg for corporate mercy. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even bother to open the heavy envelope. He just wiped his mud-stained hands slowly on his jeans, looking right past Gallagher's expensive tailored suit. The air around the farm didn't smell like rotting coffee waste anymore. It didn't intensely burn the back of the throat. It smelled incredibly of rich, dark earth, fresh morning rain, and deep, vibrant forest soil. Marcus finally looked directly at Gallagher, his expression absolutely dead calm. "I don't owe your corporation a single penny," he said softly, yet with absolute authority. "But you're about to see exactly what your garbage built." Gallagher's smug, arrogant smile faltered slightly. He didn't understand the reaction at all. He looked around the vast property. He finally noticed the three massive, highly sophisticated, climate-controlled commercial greenhouses towering quietly behind the thick tree line. He noticed the steady, powerful, continuous hum of industrial ventilation fans. "What is all this?" Gallagher demanded, his voice suddenly losing its confident, deeply mocking edge. "Where is our waste? If you've been illegally dumping it, you're standing exactly on it," Marcus replied instantly. Gallagher looked down at his incredibly expensive leather shoes in sheer horror. But he wasn't standing in acidic, toxic mud. He was standing on a perfectly manicured, incredibly dark, deeply fertile pathway. It was pure 100% premium worm castings. "I want to see inside those buildings," Gallagher aggressively demanded, pointing a wildly shaking finger at the massive greenhouses. "Right now, if you are illegally storing our industrial waste, we will absolutely destroy you." Marcus didn't aggressively argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just turned around slowly and walked directly toward the largest greenhouse. "Follow me." When Marcus confidently pushed open the heavy, perfectly insulated double doors of the greenhouse, a massive wave of cool, perfectly humidified air rushed out. Gallagher stepped hesitantly inside and his jaw practically hit the solid concrete floor. There was absolutely no garbage. There was absolutely no foul stench. Instead, towering industrial metal racks stretched all the way up to the massive 20-foot ceiling, perfectly illuminated by precise computer-automated LED grow lights. On those heavy racks were thousands upon thousands of white, perfectly rectangular fruiting blocks. And aggressively exploding from every single block were massive, flawless clusters of premium, highly sought-after gourmet shiitake and giant oyster mushrooms. It was a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar agricultural operation hiding brilliantly right in the middle of a muddy, entirely forgotten rural farm. "Your massive factory produces 40 tons of coffee waste every single month," Marcus said, his voice echoing powerfully in the massive greenhouse. "It's highly acidic. It's completely useless to you. It's a massive, devastating financial liability. You are arrogantly paying us a pathetic $50 a week just to take your massive logistical problem away." Marcus walked casually over to a heavy rack, snapped off a massive, absolutely perfect shiitake mushroom, and tossed it firmly to Gallagher. The corporate manager caught it clumsily, staring closely at it like it was an alien artifact. "Ray, carefully pasteurize your toxic waste," Marcus continued, pacing slowly and deliberately down the long aisle. "We aggressively mix it with pure hardwood sawdust. We scientifically use it to perfectly cultivate premium gourmet mushrooms. And when the massive mushrooms are done fruiting, we feed the spent blocks directly to our massive worm colonies to actively create the absolute richest organic fertilizer in the entire state." Gallagher stared blankly at the massive mushroom in his violently shaking hand. His highly trained MBA brain was desperately trying to calculate the intense profit margins. How much are you selling these for?" he stammered, the intense corporate arrogance completely drained from his trembling voice. "We heavily supply the top 50 high-end luxury restaurants in Toronto," Marcus replied completely coldly. "We gross over $2 million a year, using entirely your garbage." Gallagher was entirely speechless. The massive $80,000 lawsuit in his hand suddenly felt like an absolute pathetic joke. He arrogantly came here to aggressively bankrupt a poor farmer over a pathetic $50 a week. Instead, he had just brutally discovered that this so-called garbage boy had brilliantly built a multi-million-dollar business empire entirely on the back of Northgate's toxic trash. And the massive Northgate Corporation didn't own a single pathetic penny of it. Gallagher's perfectly manicured hands were visibly violently shaking. He looked frantically at the massive, incredibly high-tech greenhouse, then down at the absolutely perfect shiitake mushroom in his trembling hand, and finally back at the thick $80,000 lawsuit securely tucked under his arm. His highly aggressive, deeply arrogant corporate strategy had just violently, spectacularly backfired in the absolute worst way imaginable. If he actually sued Marcus Calloway and legally terminated the disposal contract, the massive Northgate factory would immediately lose their absolute cheapest, most reliable waste disposal site on the planet. The massive factory produced 40 tons of highly acidic coffee waste every single month. The commercial county dump would heavily charge them hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in premium tipping fees just to safely process that much hazardous organic matter. The incredibly pathetic $50 a week they were arrogantly paying. Marcus wasn't a corporate expense. It was an absolute, unbelievable steal. It was the only specific thing keeping Northgate's tight, highly scrutinized logistics budget completely in the green. Gallagher slowly lowered the heavy legal envelope. He aggressively cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain his shattered corporate composure. "Well," he stammered, his voice incredibly tight and uneven. "Clearly there has been a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding here, since you are obviously operating a highly profitable, massive commercial enterprise, heavily using our proprietary waste materials. I deeply think it's only fair that we formally renegotiate the terms of our historical arrangement. Northgate should absolutely, definitely be entitled to a massive percentage of these high profits." Gallagher expected Marcus to flinch. He expected the farmer to finally recognize the absolute power of the multi-million-dollar corporation. He even subtly tapped his expensive leather briefcase, hinting heavily at the army of corporate lawyers he had waiting back in the city. Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. He just reached deeply into the pocket of his dirt-stained canvas apron and pulled out a single, perfectly neatly folded piece of paper. It wasn't a frantic countersuit. It was a professionally printed commercial invoice. "You're exactly completely right," Marcus said, incredibly coldly. "We absolutely do need to immediately renegotiate. Effective immediately as of this very second, I am no longer quietly accepting your toxic waste for a pathetic $50 a week." Gallagher's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. "Now hold on a second. We have a legally binding historical contract. You just arrogantly handed me an official legal notice, completely terminating that exact contract, Marcus pointed out flawlessly, gesturing smoothly to the thick envelope, still tightly clutched in Gallagher's heavily sweating hand. So as of exactly 5 minutes ago, we have absolutely no legal agreement whatsoever. You have 40 tons of intensely toxic coffee waste sitting directly on your factory floor right now, actively fermenting and aggressively rotting. And I know for an absolute fact that the county commercial dump won't touch it without a highly mandatory, extremely expensive 30-day environmental review. Gallagher felt a cold, sharp, terrifying sweat break out intensely on his forehead. His heavy breathing quickened. Marcus was absolutely terrifyingly right. He perfectly understood Northgate's severe logistical vulnerabilities better than their own logistics manager. The massive factory floor was already heavily backing up with wet, violently acidic sludge. If the logistics team couldn't legally dump it today, the entire multi-million-dollar production line would have to completely permanently shut down by tomorrow morning. A total complete factory shutdown would cost the corporation millions in instantly lost revenue. It would completely, utterly destroy Gallagher's arrogant career. What are your exact new terms? Gallagher asked, his entire MBA arrogance completely, entirely shattered into tiny pieces. Marcus confidently handed him the single printed piece of paper. The new commercial disposal fee is exactly $2,000 a week, payable fully in advance. If you don't absolutely like it, you can take your toxic garbage back to your pristine corporate factory and try to pay your massive environmental fines with it. Gallagher stared blankly at the printed invoice. It was an absolutely brutal, completely devastating 4,000% price increase. But even at a staggering $2,000 a week, it was still vastly, significantly cheaper than the commercial county dump's highly expensive tipping fees. Marcus hadn't just arrogantly picked a random number. He had perfectly precisely calculated the exact absolute financial pain point of the massive corporation. Gallagher had absolutely no corporate leverage left. He came here to ruthlessly, aggressively bankrupt a poor, uneducated farmer, and instead he was the one being perfectly legally extorted by an absolute masterclass in pure supply and demand economics. I have to make a highly urgent phone call, Gallagher muttered weakly, his face completely pale and terrified. He practically sprinted back in an absolute panic to his brand new silver BMW, aggressively locking himself tightly inside the pristine, leather-lined cabin. He spent 20 agonizing, humiliating minutes fiercely on the phone with his senior corporate superiors in Toronto. Through the dark tinted glass, Marcus could see Gallagher waving his arms frantically in sheer panic, desperately trying to explain exactly how a muddy, entirely forgotten 15-year-old garbage dump had suddenly become a multi-million-dollar choke point for their entire global supply chain. When Gallagher finally stepped heavily out of the expensive car, he looked completely, utterly defeated. His highly tailored suit looked wrinkled and pathetic. He didn't say a single arrogant word. He just slowly pulled out a heavy corporate checkbook, quietly wrote a certified corporate check for $8,000 to fully cover the first month, strictly in advance, and handed it absolutely silently to Marcus. The massive fleet of trucks is waiting nervously on the county road, Gallagher said, incredibly quietly, staring completely defeated at the dark mud on his highly expensive Italian shoes. Marcus calmly took the heavy corporate check. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat at all. He just gave a single firm, deeply authoritative nod. Send them in. Less than an hour later, the quiet rural gravel driveway of the Callaway farm rumbled like a massive, violent earthquake. A massive, endless convoy of 20 heavy yellow Ford dump trucks crawled incredibly slowly up the muddy road. Their massive air brakes hissed violently as they lined up one by one perfectly along the newly reinforced wooden fence line. The heavy metal beds tilted up and hundreds of thousands of pounds of wet, steaming coffee sludge poured aggressively onto the ground like a dark, completely unstoppable avalanche. The incredibly sharp, intensely sour stench of actively fermenting acid heavily filled the crisp air once again. But Marcus didn't grab a heavy, splintered wooden shovel this time. He stood quietly, completely confident on the wraparound porch of his newly renovated, custom-built, massive farmhouse, peacefully drinking a warm cup of premium black coffee. He watched completely silently as a highly trained professional team of his own paid employees driving high-end, fully enclosed John Deere skid steers. effortlessly scooped up the massive piles of toxic waste. They smoothly moved the sludge with absolute mechanical precision directly to the automated trommel screens and the massive steel pasteurization tanks. 15 years ago, that exact same yellow dump truck had brought his grieving mother to her absolute knees, forcing her to desperately beg for $50 just to survive the brutal winter. It had completely ruined his clothes, completely alienated his high school friends, and deeply made him the pathetic garbage boy of the entire county. Now 20 of those exact same massive trucks were heavily lining up for miles, anxiously waiting to pay him a massive, incredible premium just for the distinct, highly sought-after privilege of dropping off the raw materials for his absolute multi-million-dollar empire. Marcus Calloway didn't just build a successful farm. He completely redefined the concept of waste. He looked at 40 tons of toxic, highly acidic sludge, a problem that a massive multi-million-dollar corporation was desperate to throw away, and he recognized the raw, untapped energy hidden inside of it. Most people look at the unfair hands they are dealt in life, and they see garbage. They see an acidic, toxic environment that will slowly kill their dreams, just like those first potato plants. They let the weight of their circumstances bury them. But Marcus proved that the most fertile ground for massive growth isn't always found in a pristine, perfectly manicured greenhouse. Sometimes the greatest opportunities are buried at the bottom of the very thing that everyone else is running away from. The corporation thought they were throwing their useless trash over the fence. They didn't realize they were delivering the exact fuel a young boy needed to build an empire. Because in business and in life, the world will constantly try to dump its problems, its negativity, and its toxic waste directly onto your doorstep. But here is the undeniable truth that Marcus Calloway learned in the mud. They can dump their waste on your land, but they don't decide what you grow from it. If you are ready to take the garbage in your life and start turning it into your greatest asset, hit the subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below with the word GROW if you refuse to let your circumstances define your future. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share this video with them. Until next time, keep building.